Speaking of the defense budget, former Marine Corps General Arnold Panuro said that the Pentagon spends more, takes longer, and we get less. Hello and welcome to the Weichert Report's next podcast. I'm Brandon Weichert, founder and CEO of the Weichert Report, and we're going to be talking about America's broken defense budget. At a time when threats across the board are multiplying, and the United States House of Representatives has just passed a $696 billion defense budget, which includes funding for such things as preparing for anthropogenic climate change and a space corps, the latter of which I support vehemently, we don't seem to have our eye on the ball. What are America's strategic interests? How should we counter rising threats such as China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda? Case of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We have been engaged in a 17-year-long war in Afghanistan with no end in sight, and we have been now engaged in quote-unquote contingency operations against ISIS in Syria. We are also engaged throughout the Middle East. What are the two most ubiquitous weapons that we have used in these two wars? Special forces and unmanned aerial drones. And it would stand to reason, with the influx or the increased demand in special forces, we need to increase the number of special forces teams. Yet in order to do that, you have to increase the size of ground forces, because it is from those regular infantry units that the special forces members are called from. And yet this is the one thing that we have been reticent to do. When he left as the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Odierno, claimed that the Obama-era sequestration cuts were catastrophic. Ground forces have been slashed, the Army's brigades have been diminished, and the ability to conduct multiple operations in multiple theaters has been seriously restrained. And it will take years to get those capacities back, because when you cut units, you have to then factor in retraining, re-equipping, resupplying, redeploying. This takes years. Unmanned aerial vehicles are relatively cheap, and they have been more successful in our war on terror than any smart bomb or any F-35 Joint Strike Fighter has been. Yet we continue to refuse to invest in expanding the operational capacity and the fleet size of our unmanned vehicles. In fact, the Navy wants to build greater shares of unmanned vehicles to launch from aircraft carriers, because China in Asia, China and North Korea both are developing methods and tactics capable of threatening our manned systems like the F-35. Yet the Navy is increasingly forced to fund the boondoggle that is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which costs about $100 billion per plane. That's to say nothing of the amount of money it costs to then repair those planes, because as they come off the factory line, they are beset with glitches, to say the least. I remember a famous story from last year in which the military was reluctant to deploy F-35s in the rain for training missions, because the F-35s didn't work in rain. Just a ridiculous thing. So we are increasingly expanding the U.S. defense budget, but that money is not going to actual warfighting capabilities. In most cases, it's going toward personnel costs. And I'm not talking about uniform military, though that's a huge share of the pie. It's not even going toward uniformed military personnel engaged in combat. Because remember, about 1% of our population is actually within the military, as Thomas Ricks has written about repeatedly in his works. And an even fewer share of those people in the all-volunteer force are actually on the front lines engaged in combat operations. Many of them are engaged behind lines in logistical capacity. Then on the other end, the civilian workforce, which is, in my view, redundant and not really needed, is between costs for paying them as well as retirement packages and benefits. These things are all contributing to a bloated defense budget. The money of that $696 billion, if it gets through the Senate and is enacted, a lot of that is not going to go toward actual warfighting. It's going to go toward the jobs program. Now, of course, you have to ask yourself, how many human resources managers does it really take to fly a B-52 bomber? That's beside the point, obviously. Of course, General Stephen Wilson of the Air Force disagrees with my assessment. In February of this year, General Wilson argued that, quote, 96% of our civilian workforce works outside of Washington, D.C. They work in places like our depots on our flight lines. And if we can't hire, then that has a direct impact of readiness, end quote. Of course, readiness is a very important thing for our military. Secretary of Defense Mattis has made readiness his #1 priority. And readiness is defined defined as the ability of the U.S. military to rise at the drop of a hat to meet a challenger anywhere in the world. That capability means maintaining a reliable supply chain for our forces, and that means having civilian contractors and civilian employees. Yet I cannot help but wonder if the way things are currently structured is the most efficient. Indeed, I believe things are most inefficient today. This is a byproduct of the way that the political and economic interests have aligned. You look at the basing system. Our bases are kept open or closed not on strategic need, but on congressional electoral concerns. The way we buy and field new weapons systems is not because we need them. Of course, we always need weapons systems, but it's based on the economic interests of the contractors. It's based on the political interests of congressional leaders. These congressional leaders want contracts in their district in order to claim that they're bringing jobs to their district to justify their re-election. The military is happy to go along with it because the military always wants new toys, and they, as a institution, like all bureaucracies, have to justify their own existence, so they have to justify increases in their budget. They can't give money back because that would be considered a loss. The incentive system in the public sector is quite different from the incentive system in the private sector. Plus the entire DoD system is somewhat corrupted by the fact that the defense contractors promise cushy jobs after retirement, not only for the military brass, but also for congressmen who may lose re-election. This all creates a really bad negative incentive system, which creates government bloat. And so we have in the procurement system, we're getting increasingly diminishing returns on high-tech, over-expensive, barely workable systems like the F-35 or the Navy's littoral combat ship. We're not investing in the actual equipment that we need. One simple thing that we need is better armor for our troops who are actually going overseas to fight. We're so busy preparing to fight the great war of tomorrow that will likely never come, that we're missing the threats of today. If you look at near-peer rivals, China spends a fraction of what we do on the military. In fact, a report came out in May indicating that China was significantly reducing its ground forces. It was redirecting the budget it would use to fund its 2.5 million man army, and it was cutting that military force in half, and it was redirecting those funds into developing its navy, its informational warfare capabilities, its space warfare capabilities, and its missile systems. Why? Well, because Chinese military budget is predicated on Chinese strategic needs. China doesn't need, at least they don't think, though I would argue with Russia on their border, they probably should think about it. China assumes they don't need a major ground force any longer. That modern warfare means that inherently they will need more technology and greater integration of metal and men and machine that will require less actual ground forces. And also, more importantly, they have strategic ambitions for dominating East Asia, which means they will need a larger navy, they will need greater information warfare capabilities, greater space warfare capabilities, and greater missile systems. And so they're very closely tethering their very limited defense budget into technologies and systems that actually will further their strategic interests. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're so busy paying for human resources managers or keeping bases open that have political benefits but no real strategic or economic benefits, and spending money on systems that are not exactly what we need, that are beset with cost overruns and technological inefficiency. Something's got to give. Congress needs to start exercising its oversight authority, which it is wont to do. Last year, it was found that upwards of $125 billion of the Pentagon's budget just went missing. Before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld had a famous congressional hearing in which he admitted that upwards of $1 trillion was lost in the Pentagon. Of course, 9/11 happened, so people weren't able to launch the kind of audit that would have likely ensued had those terrible attacks not happened and had America not been forced to go onto a war footing. In my view, the number one issue should be to target those programs and those personnel that we really don't need and to cut them. This would then allow us to redirect that large budget into buying systems that we need to overcome threats. In the case of Afghanistan, we need more special forces. We need greater levels of unmanned aerial vehicles. That's where we should be spending the money. Across the board, we need greater cyberspace warfare capabilities. Those are not actually very costly systems. The one big expense, as I've argued in my lecture series at IWP and in my forthcoming book, the actual cost of space systems can be lowered through procurement reform, allowing startups to get involved rather than the usual suspects of defense contractors, opening up the competitive bidding processes for contracts, making our wartime systems more compatible with commercial systems, really reducing inefficiency like that. And so these are things that can be done. They could take a few years to implement, but the reforms can be done, especially with proper congressional leadership. And this will lower the costs overall. So the Space Corps would be the only really costly thing, but with budgetary reform and with procurement reform, you can really lower the costs of fielding and developing a space warfare capability. In the case of China and Russia, for instance, greater anti-ballistic missile systems are needed, like THAAD or the Iron Dome system in Israel. I would prefer, though, ultimately fielding, as I've argued, fielding a space-based missile defense system, not unlike what Reagan envisioned with Star Wars or Strategic Defense Initiative. But that may be long run. In the short term, we're going to need more ABM systems. Also, the Navy is increasingly convinced that it will be less and less capable of risking its aircraft carriers in the face of Chinese anti-carrier missile systems, such as the Dongfeng 21D, the non-nuclear missile that has the capacity to completely destroy an American supercarrier. The American supercarriers cost hundreds of billions of dollars to build and maintain and field, and yet for the cost of a few $1 million, the Chinese may be able to sink them, or at least render their ability to launch aircraft in the time of war. It has the ability to render them completely useless. And if they were to render even one American supercarrier useless, America's desire or willpower to risk more of its 12 hyper-expensive aircraft carriers will have been diminished, which is what the Chinese want. It's not necessarily about defeating America outright. It's about raising the cost to such a point that America defeats itself because it doesn't want to risk its beautiful weapons of war. So instead of just giving into that strategic paradigm, why doesn't the United States look into investing into submarines that can launch unmanned aerial vehicles, that can get close to China's coast, that can get close to our enemies and launch unmanned aerial vehicles? China has been investing heavily in ultra-quiet diesel submarines. They have deployed them in the Taiwan Strait. They're not interested in going out and challenging America at the high seas near Hawaii. They want America, if America decides to get too close to Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion, they want to be able to sink American aircraft carriers and sink American warships. And let me tell you something, those diesel-class submarines are very hard to target and destroy. And in fact, China has a surplus of those kinds of submarines, and America's submarines fleet is not properly deployed in a way to counter that threat. All of this is to say that it's not a question of needing more money for the Defense Department. It's a question of needing serious reform, and that requires congressional leadership. And as long as our oversight is not enforced because of the negative incentives caused by special interests, we are never going to have a truly reformed defense budget. And so long as the defense budget remains unreformed, our ability to adequately counter threats will be hamstrung. Is it any wonder that we have been unable, with all of these whiz-bang newfangled technologies, that we have been unable to effectively defeat Al-Qaeda, which is basically a band of religious zealots ensconced in 7th century ideology, living in caves, wielding AK-47s, whose best weapon is the IED or suicide bomber vest? How have we been unable to defeat them? We are starting to defeat ISIS, but until recently, we have been completely unable and unwilling to defeat ISIS. How is it that we are constantly now being told by U.S. Pacific Command that, well, we can't really interdict the way that we wanted to in Asia anymore because of China's growing threat? I thought spending $500+ billion a year on the technical services, primarily on our Navy, on our Air Force, meant that we would never have to face a rival near-peer competitor. Of course, this is no longer so. Our enemies have gotten smarter and have learned to do more with less. And meanwhile, we have learned to do less with more. And it's a very bad situation that we find ourselves in. And if the United States does not start reforming its defense budget right quick, that does not mean spending more money. That does not mean throwing more money at the problem. That means congressional leaders sitting down and going over with a fine-tooth comb, auditing the defense budget, and finding inefficiencies, finding bloat, finding redundancies, and cutting them. And telling our Secretary of Defense, telling our defense strategists, hey, look, you need to tether your budget requests to ends, ways, and means. We are a global military with global commitments, but to govern is to choose, particularly in the post-2008 recession. recession period. Whether this gets done or not is another story. My hope, and I don't think it will come into fruition, is that the Senate stands up for reason and forces a reassessment. We'll see. Until then, China gets to cut their military budget and still continues to apparently be a true and growing threat to America's ability to project power in Asia. And meanwhile, we continue to be stymied by insurgents in Afghanistan. This is not a tenable situation. Eventually, something will have to give. Reform is needed. For the Weichert Report, I'm Brandon Weichert. Have a nice day.